Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for this webinar. My name is Deborah Shushan. I'm the Director of Government Affairs for J Street, and I'm here with two guests who are going to be talking with me today about the EU and European states and their responses to Israel's potential annexation of significant parts of the West Bank. This is a very timely issue, as I'm probably everyone who's tuned in today knows. According to the coalition agreement that was signed by Prime Minister Netanyahu and Benny Gantz of the Blue and White Party, anytime after July 1st, which was, of course, last week, the Israeli government could potentially move ahead with annexation of parts of the West Bank. And we've seen different kinds of reactions from various regions of the world. And one of the regions that we have yet to talk about here on JStream, but one that I think is very important, is Europe and its reaction. We have seen some significant reactions from both the EU and European states individually. There are significant divisions and differences among European states regarding how they will or how they already have reacted to the possibility of annexation. And so we're looking forward to talking about this subject here today. And I'm going to introduce our two panelists who are with us. We have Martin Konechny, who is the director of the European Middle East Project. Before he founded the European Middle East Project, he was Brussels Director of Crisis Action, which is an organization that focuses on protection of civilians in armed conflicts in Israel-Palestine, as well as other conflicts like Sudan and South Sudan, Syria, Afghanistan, and Congo. He also has served in the past as an analyst at Open Society Foundations, covering the Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us, Martin.
Hi, Deborah. Hello, everyone.
Hi, Martin. We also have with us from Israel, Dr. Maya Sion Tzidkiyahu. I hope I pronounced that right.
Excellent.
Thank you. Thank you. I practiced many, many times. She is the director of the program on Israel-European relations at the Mitvim Institute in Israel. She is also co-president of the European Association for the Study of European Integration. She is an adjunct professor of European Studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and also teaches at Tel Aviv University. Her course offerings include courses on the European Union integration process, EU-Israel relations, and comparative politics more broadly.
Indeed.
Welcome to you, Maya.
It's evening here in Israel right now, so good evening, everybody, or good afternoon to you.
Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. So we are going to proceed today with some remarks from Martin first and then from Maya. And then, as always, we will have a question and answer period. Of course, we always ask audience members to submit your questions so that we can have the panelists discuss them. So I just want to refer you at the bottom of your Zoom, you'll see a little icon that says Q&A. You can click on that, and at any time during our conversation, you can put in a question. And so I have those available to ask our panelists after their remarks. And with that, Martin, we turn to you first.
Thanks again. Hello, everyone. I will maybe kick off with what Deborah already mentioned, which is divisions inside the EU, which are indeed quite important for this discussion. And I would say, first of all, that there is actually a great degree of underlying unity, which is sometimes lost in the media reporting. Sometimes the media tend to exaggerate the degree of internal divisions. So actually, the situation is that all 27 member states are against annexation and agree that the Israeli annexation would be a violation of international law. You know, on occasions, some member states have blocked statements, but that was generally because of timing or other issues or other excuses, one could say. But on other occasions, all 27 have agreed actually to speak against the Israeli annexation and in support of the traditional EU position of support for the two-state solution and respect for international law, etc. Now, I don't want to gloss over those divisions, but just to say it's quite a nuanced picture. To explain those divisions a little bit, I would say there are mainly three camps, one could say, among the member states of the EU. The first camp is I would say the member states who tend to be most critical of the Israeli conduct, Israeli policies, including annexation. And those are states including France, Sweden, Belgium, Ireland, Luxembourg, and a couple of others, Spain, Portugal, for example. Then on the very other side of the spectrum, you have states who tend to be most kind of accommodating to the Israeli government and least willing to be critical, and who tend to tone down common statements and sometimes block them. And so there you have primarily the states of Central and Eastern Europe, largely formerly communist states, including the Czech Republic, which is my home country, Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, Croatia, but also Austria is now, I think, quite clearly in this camp. And then the third camp is sort of, it's not really a camp, but basically it's the middle states, which are between those two camps, where I would put, for example, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Denmark. And these camps and categorizations, they shift over time because it's not only geography which determines the positions, but also whether you have a more left-wing or more right-wing government in a given country. So if there is a left-wing government, then they tend to be more critical of the Israeli policies. If you have a right-wing government, they tend to be more accommodating. But generally, I would say that the geography is more important than the political divides. So even a center-left, left of center government in Germany will tend to be less critical of the Israeli policies than a right-wing or right of center government in a country like Ireland or Sweden. And with Germany, I said they are somewhere in the middle, but they are also with kind of one foot in the camp, which is more accommodating to the Israeli policies. That's sort of where they come from, also given their history or how they interpret and base their policy on their history. I mentioned Hungary being in the camp of those member states who are most accommodating to the Israeli government, but one could say they are in a camp of their own because over the last 3-4 years, Viktor Orban's Hungary has really drifted away, and it's like a planet which has left the solar system. Not only on foreign policy, but also, as everyone will know, when it comes to domestic politics, it can no longer be considered a liberal democracy. They have gone authoritarian. And they also happen to be Netanyahu government's best friend in the EU. So they have been by far the country which has most frequently blocked European action or statements, not only on Israel-Palestine, but on a number of foreign policy issues, most recently, even Hong Kong and Ukraine and Syria and Egypt, you name it. It seems like the focus of the Hungarian foreign policy is primarily to block and obstruct common European foreign policy. But this should not distract actually from the importance of the largest member states, which is France and Germany. And I think what is decisive for the relatively feeble European position or response to the Israeli annexation plans, and I will go more into that, is the French President Macron's position, because he is not really invested in the issue. Because if you really want Europe to move somewhere, you need France and Germany to work together, the Franco-German motor. And Germany on this issue traditionally will not lead. They can sort of lead behind, but they need France to be sort of in advance. And I did say that France is certainly in the camp of those countries who are willing to be more critical of the Israeli policies, and you can see it in their statements on annexation as well, but they are also not really invested in it greatly at the top with Macron himself. He has been much more invested in issues like Iran and Libya than this one, at least for now. So I think this is really important for understanding where the Europeans are. I did mention at the beginning that when it comes to statements, there is an underlying unity, but when we move to possibility of any actions, that's where the unity tends to break. I think this is doubly so in this case because it's not only about the relationship with Israel, but also with the United States, which is backing or has been very much involved, and one could say has laid the groundwork actually for the possibility of annexation with the Trump plan. I think I would say it is unlikely that we will see very significant responses from the EU to annexation in the form of sanctions, for example. I know it's, when you read the media, Israeli media, for example, but also international, one day they mention that the EU is thinking about imposing sanctions. The next day you read that the Europeans will not do anything. And it's quite confusing. And indeed, the discussion is still quite open, but I think it's quite clear that you will not see formal sanctions. That said, it is possible that the EU will adopt some more specific, one could say smaller measures. However, those measures could also have actually quite some impact on EU-Israel relations. And that's because of the overall weight of the EU and the extent of the EU-Israel relations. So the EU is Israel's first trading partner. At the end of last year, it was actually trading, the volume was almost twice as large as the US-Israeli trade. Now, the UK has left the EU, so that difference has gone down a bit, but the EU clearly is still way ahead when it comes to the overall trade volume with Israel. And beyond trade, there is a really extensive relationship on many fronts between EU and Israel. Israel has sort of privileged status in many different areas of EU engagements. In particular, there's a lot of research cooperation and funding that also goes from the EU to Israeli companies in this regard. This provides, on this basis, even small measures that the EU may take will be actually felt in Israel. So I don't want to, definitely, one should not dismiss the potential EU impact to annexation completely. I mentioned research cooperation, the negotiations on Israel's participation in this EU research funding scheme, which is called Horizon Europe, will be actually happening later this year and probably in the beginning of next year for the whole next 7 years. So the annexation debate will probably factor into that discussion, although I think it's very unlikely that the Europeans would cut out Israel completely from this research cooperation, but perhaps it could lead to some scale down or reduction of the scope of Israel's participation. That's possible. Another area where we could see consequences is the so-called differentiation policy, which is about treatment of Israeli settlements, meaning that settlements and everything which is beyond the green line is given a different status in EU-Israel relations than Israel within its internationally recognized borders, meaning within the green line. It's not a boycott policy, it's not a boycott of settlements, but it's making a difference. So for example, the EU continues trading with the settlements, but they should not receive a preferential treatment that Israeli goods can benefit from. The other examples of such differentiation measures are the differential labeling of settlement products. So goods from settlements should not be labeled as made in Israel, but as made in Israeli settlements, or the so-called funding guidelines, which stipulate that basically no European public funding should be going to settlements. And there are further measures such as these. And it is possible that with annexation, we will see this policy expanded to other areas of bilateral relations. The policy is really based on EU's respect for international law and for its own law, the EU's own law. So it is not really meant as a tool to pressure Israel, but it's more about protecting the EU's own legal order. But it can have, significant implications for the bilateral relations. Now, the thing is that the EU is not very far in preparing any response to the potential annexation. And that's why it is hard to give a straight answer to what will happen, because we just don't know at this moment. About more than a month and a half ago, the EU said that they will prepare an options paper, but it still has not been released. The prevailing approach seems to be to wait and see if annexation happens at all. And there is real uncertainty about whether and how it will happen at the moment. But I think the Europeans are once again missing an opportunity here, because if you don't put at least some cards on the table, then the EU can be more easily dismissed as, all talk, no action. And if the Europeans indicated the possible consequences at this stage without necessarily committing to them, that would, they would be, I think, taken more seriously. I should also say that differentiation, that this whole policy is not something that should be done in response to annexation. Once again, it's a legally based policy which stems from the whole settlement enterprise and from the Israeli occupation. It is something that the EU should have been adopting on a larger scale already years ago in response to settlements, and not in response to annexation, which one could say would deserve a stronger response. But this is where we are. I will end with one more point, which is that while the immediate response of the EU is not likely to be massive, though, as I said, there may be some, the longer term cost may be more significant. The opportunity cost to the development of relations between Israel and the EU. Because the EU has put different carrots on the table in the past, such as what is called special privileged partnership back in 2014 or 15. Basically, willingness to upgrade relations with Israel quite significantly further. And so this potential is not being realized. And as the gulf between Europe and Israel grows with the potential annexation, then it will make it much harder to develop these relations further. And I think that will be the main long-term consequence of annexation. I will stop here, and I can go into more details in questions and answers.
Thank you so much, Martin. That was a really helpful way of getting us started off. Before I turn it over to Maya, I just want to remind our audience that you should feel free, as some have already done, which I appreciate. You should feel free at any point to go to the Q&A at the bottom of your screen and submit questions for our two excellent panelists today. And with that, I turn it over to you, Dr. Maya Sion Sidkiyahu. We're looking forward to your comments. Thanks.
Okay, wonderful. So I want to give just a few remarks to Martin, and then to spread a little bit the Israeli scene with regards to political parties and what is the attitude in Israel towards the European criticism and the warnings against annexation. So first, when you divide Europe into camps, you do really see that the big difference between the member states and their position. And for example, you see Hungary sort of as a camp within itself. Its foreign minister was saying just a few weeks ago that whatever criticism, harsh criticism would be on Israel, they would veto, or at least that was the understanding from his declaration. And on the other hand, you would see other countries, small and big, such as Luxembourg and France, really pushing forward this camp of 7, 8, maybe more member states that wants to have measures taken vis-a-vis Israel if annexation takes place. So there's a really big spectrum there in the EU, and Germany. Germany is about to play a very big role here because on the 1st of July, it entered the presidency seat in the European Union Council, or the Council of the European Union, to be more exact. And it also has the presidency of the European Commission, which is very different. It's supposed to be not so much a political nomination. It doesn't speak, Ursula von der Leyen doesn't speak on behalf of Germany, but obviously she is aware of the German position, and to some extent she relates to it. And Germany also is in a position of the UN Security Council presidency. So Germany is about to play a very dominant role here. And Germany is actually a moderating player in Europe in that regards because of its special relations with Israel after World War II, the Shoah. It has a commitment to the security of Israel and cannot, for the time being, cannot push sanctions against Israel. So Germany will play a moderating role, even though that when she sits at the Council of the European Union Council, then she is supposed to be sort of impartial, to some respect, impartial player. So that was just a few comments, and we can go into it in more details afterwards in the Q&A. I'm more of a specialist to the European Union than to Israeli politics, but obviously, sitting in Israel, then I would speak about what's going on here in Israel. And I would like to relate it to all those statements that are coming in very strongly. Since the Trump deal of the century plan was published, the European Union, at the beginning was saying we want to learn this proposal and we want to examine it. And a week afterwards, it already was announcing that the EU is coming back to its main position of two-state solution, done in a negotiation by a dialogue between the two sides, and the Trump sort of peace plan was stepping out of all the parameters, the agreed parameters that the international community used to respect until then, and especially the EU. The EU was the main leader pushing for a two-state solution already in 1980, and that was way before the United States was putting that on the table. And the EU has stuck to this position since and hardly changed it. So the two-state solution is sort of a mantra by the EU that in Israel, I think the debate in the last decade has shifted to some extent. Definitely the way Israelis view Europe is quite problematic, I would say, or if I would put it more correctly or more in an exact manner, the way Israelis look at the European Union is with much criticism and looking at it as a pro-Palestinian actor. And we do see the different states, member states in the EU, and we see the different shades and the different positions that they take. And obviously we see Germany as a big friend of Israel, and other countries that Martin has described their camps. So we can talk about the Czech Republic, obviously, we can talk about Hungary, we can talk about in the last 4 years, since 2016, we can talk about Greece, Cyprus, even Malta, the Baltic countries, Romania, Bulgaria, countries that have come to the assistance of Israel when the European Union tries to criticize Israel and pass a resolution that is not comfortable to Israel. But when we come to annexation, then I completely agree with Martin. All 27 member states are against annexation, and this has to do with European agendas of Russia, annexation of Crimea. So if Russia was, if the response to the annexation of Crimea was sanctions, and Martin, I can use your words with a big S, right? So really harsh sanctions against Russia, then how can Europe react to Israel in a very different manner, not imposing such sanctions on this annexation? And we can talk about different rationales, even legal rationales for this, for this differentiation between Russia, or this special treatment that Israel receives from Europe. And we can rationalize it to some extent. And some of it is the special treatment that Israel receives from the international community, or European community, to be more exact. So let me just spread out a little bit the political scene here in Israel with regards to annexation, and also the public opinion here, and to relate it to what some of the political parties think about the European Union criticism. And I've just received a couple of hours ago an article that Yair Lapid, the head of Yesh Atid political party, is about to publish, and he actually relates to Europe there, and he has some interesting words there. So obviously on the very right side of the political spectrum in Israel, where you see, for example, Naftali Bennett, Ayelet Shaked, so Kadima party, you see a wish for a full annexation of all Area C. So the Palestinian Authority is divided, or the Palestinian Judea and Samaria are divided into 3 parts, where in A, the Palestinians have full security and civil authority, and C area, where they don't have not the civil and not the security authority. And this C area, which is about 30% of the territories, this is what in the Trump plan is supposed to be negotiated between the countries that would be annexed to Israel with under negotiation and agreement with the Palestinian Authority, which has obviously rejected this plan. So what Kadima would have liked to see is to drop the 2-state solution. It does not accept the Trump plan. It does not want to see a Palestinian state being built, but it does want to annex all those territories that it can in Judea and Samaria. Obviously, the Likud party are doing whatever whatever Benjamin Netanyahu is advocating. So we don't see any internal opposition there, or even on the details, we don't hear anything very different. Israel Beitenu, headed by Avigdor Lieberman, is criticizing Netanyahu for the annexation movement, but not going against annexation itself necessarily, but more of its political use, cynical political use in the political scene here in Israel. With the blue and white political parties that is headed by Gantz, and the foreign minister is Ashkenazi, I think it was a bit surprising, perhaps, for the Israeli audience to discover that they are not so much against annexation as would have been expected. So the coalition agreement, Deborah, that you mentioned, was a surprise to some extent. This particular article was a surprise because many of the voters of blue and white were expecting opposition to this idea of annexation, of a unilateral annexation, and were much more in favor of negotiation, of renewing some sort of talks with the Palestinians. And this is still a question mark here in Israel. What would eventually be their position? But I would also just say one more thing about blue and white. It seems that Gantz and Ashkenazi don't take too much into consideration the European views, at least not rhetorically, at least not on the table. So they do look into the opinion of the United States and look at the elections there. They do hear the Jordanian opinion and other Arab countries sort of threats coming from them. But Europe is not so much being looked upon, not very seriously, unfortunately. Yesh Atid by Yair Lapid. I would just read you again this article that is about to be published, and I hope that I'm not doing too much of a spoiler here because it hasn't been published yet. But it begins with obviously with rejection of the unilateral annexation, which is a bad idea. But it says after a few paragraphs that Europe's response to the possibility of annexation was a harsh protest. Many things were said, not all of them comfortable for us to hear. I accept that, and I being Yair Lapid, it is the right and sometimes the duty of friends to voice their opinions. And I said that to European leaders and diplomats who I've spoken to about this issue. But there are, and then he goes on to some other things that he doesn't accept from the European position. So I think this is a moderate opinion towards the European. We're willing to hear your opinion, but I'm not sure how much is it taken into account here. And left of Yesh Atid, what is left of the Labour Party here in Israel, what is left of the Meretz political party here in Israel, and obviously, you know, the Arab political party, Meretz rejects the annexation, obviously, and goes against it. It calls the two-state solution by negotiation. So this is a very wide range of opinions here in Israel in that regard. I would say, to conclude, maybe some points with regards to the decision-making process in Israel with regards to annexation, because this is very odd and very bizarre, and maybe I would also conclude with a timing issue. So there are not many specialists of security or economy or any other advisors that would support annexation. Most of the very serious and heavy weight opinion in Israel is against annexation. And this we also see in public opinion poll in Israel. Almost 46% of the public opinion is against it. Maybe 32 to 34% is for it to some degrees, and it changes, it varies along the way of annexation, the method of annexation. But we don't see the cabinet in Israel really debating annexation. There are no plans, there are no maps that are well known, and there are just different formulas being scattered around, but we don't see a serious decision-making process or preparations by government ministries that are supposed to do that. So the Ministry of Justice, for example, there's a lot of legal issues to resolve here. The Defense Ministry or the IDF, we are being warned that this may result in another intifada, another terror wave by the Palestinians vis-a-vis Israel. We are being warned on different steps by Jordan, and this requires a lot of the security forces planning and also economic planning in that regard. And we don't see any of it taking place in Israel, which is extremely worrying, how such a big decision would be made without really serious debate and weighing in. So the last remark that I want to put in is the issue of timing. So I think that to some extent, annexation was put on the table for the 1st of July, to some extent also with connection to the US elections. And this window of opportunity we see sort of narrowing down and closing down because of the polls in the United States with regards between Trump and Biden. So if obviously the elections in the United States would replace the president, then we are talking about a completely different ballgame. And I think this weighs now heavier on the Israeli, on Benjamin Netanyahu's table. With the issue of timing, we also see, and Martin referred to it, the issue of in the European Union, which is Israel's biggest trading partner, we see that the 7-year budget of the EU is about to end by the end of 2020, and the new beginning in 2021, the new multi-financial framework from 2021 until 2027 is really a junction for Israel to renew its different programs in the EU. So Horizon Europe with research and innovation, and it's also Erasmus Plus for students going to learn a semester in Europe. It's other programs that has to be renewed, like the action plan of 2004, by which we use twinning and TIEX, and I'm not going to go into it right now, but there's some mechanisms that the government use with cooperation, that form cooperation with the EU. So the timing is beginning to be much less comfortable here for Benjamin Netanyahu, from not only the European side, but also the US side. And I think that if Germany would play some sort of, or Europe would play a role of postponing, trying to postpone annexation as much as possible and further as possible, then this window of sort of convenient time, if I can say that, for Benjamin Netanyahu to go ahead with annexation would start and close in a much more rapid way. So, thank you.
Thank you so much. Wonderful comments from both of you. And so what I'd like to do in terms of questions, in addition just to reminding our audience that you can submit your questions at the bottom of your screen at the Q&A, and we've gotten lots of great questions, and I'll try to get to as many as I can. I am going to start with a couple of questions of my own, and then we'll move to audience questions. So Martin, it was really helpful, I think, to have you open with a sense of kind of three groupings, broadly speaking, that we see within Europe. And I'm wondering if Hungary is to one side, right? If Viktor Orban is to one side in terms of trying to block any European action, any serious European action against annexation, what would you see as kind of the other pole if you had to pick a state that has been willing to go the furthest in really trying to, send a strong message on annexation? I'm wondering, in particular, the one that kind of stands out in my mind, and I wonder if you might agree, might be Ireland. If you could talk about that or any other state that you see potentially in that position. And that leads me to a related question, which is if you have a country like Hungary or other Central European states like the Visegrad Four that are willing to block action on the one side, is there a possibility for meaningful action by individual European states? So Martin, why don't we turn to you first, and then Maya, I'd love for you to weigh in as well.
Right. It's a great question. Well, and the answer is quite simple, I think. There is no equivalent to Hungary on the other side of the spectrum. So we're dealing with a kind of asymmetric game where on one side of the spectrum, we have at least one country which is really willing to play hardball and obstruct EU positions and really divert from the rest of the crowd. On the other side of the spectrum, we don't have any such country. Ireland would indeed be a candidate in theory, but they are not willing to step out too far. And we have seen that the new government in Ireland, which was just appointed, I think, 2 weeks ago, 3 maybe, that they refrained from taking on this legislation that was supposed to stop imports of settlement products to Ireland. So instead of, at the moment of annexation, taking a step that would go beyond what the rest of the European bloc would do, they refrained from going in that direction. That's the one thing. But to your second question about what individual member states can do, so there is definitely space for individual member states to do a number of things, and we have seen some of them do that. They can, for example, recognize the state of Palestine, which is what Sweden did in 2014. No other member states followed since then, although there are, I think, 8, if I'm not mistaken, member states in Central and Eastern Europe who did recognize, when they were still part of the Soviet bloc. They can, individual member states, they can also be strict when it comes to differentiation in their own bilateral relations with Israel. So we have seen some member states, Denmark, Netherlands, UK, France to an extent, Germany to an extent, who have been paying attention to this distinction between Israel proper and the settlements in their cooperation projects and agreements with Israel. But I would say none of them has done it consistently and across the board, but only to an extent. So this is one area, again, where the member states could go much further. And again, this should not be tied to annexation in principle. I would, the last thing I want to say about this is we should not only think about it as individual member states, but also, coalitions of the willing. So we could see potentially groups of member states, 10, 15, who might take some action. We have seen this in the past. For example, there was a group of 16 EU member states which called on the EU to adopt the guidelines on the labeling of settlement products a couple of years ago, and similar such initiatives.
I think I can add maybe the perspectives from the EU and its institutions and the way the decision-making process in the EU is being formed. And there we see the different potential. For example, if we take Ireland and the boycott legislation that was trying, they tried to pass to boycott settlements products. For example, they cannot do it. Ireland cannot do it. Even if the law would pass the Parliament of Ireland, that would not be legal under the EU law, because trade issues are under the exclusive competence of the European Union. So no member state of the EU can declare that it boycotts any settlement products or Israeli products, for that being said. And this is under a consensus decision by the 27 member states, because in the association agreement that Israel signed in 1995 with the European Union, there is Article 2 that allows the European Union to sort of, maybe not cancel, but to suspend the association agreement if human rights violations are being made, or even democratic principles or international law principles, which obviously is the case with annexation. But this would not take place, again, because of Hungary, because of maybe other member states. Also Germany is unwilling to go with sanctions against Israel. So to suspend the association agreement and the free trade agreement that goes in it, that would be a harsh measure, very harsh measure against Israel. As Martin was referring to, 34 or 30 more percent of Israeli export is going to the EU, and 46% of our import comes from the EU. So to touch upon that, this would be very harsh. to do differentiation with the territories and not to allow the products from the settlements to go to the EU under those privileged conditions of free trade agreement, this is something very different, and this is really negligible for the Israeli economy. This has maybe less than 1% of our export goes from the settlements. So this is, and the Israeli government finds its way to compensate where, for example, the EU demands to take customs from those products because they're not part of the agreement with Israel, the way the EU sees it. So this is really, from economic perspectives, to go along with differentiation policy hardly harms Israel. So sanctions would only be really significant to Israel if the association agreement is being suspended, and this is off the table. And again, with trade policy, you need a consensus by the member states, and this is not the case. The EU doesn't have this willingness, and it's not just Hungary; it's even Germany. So it's a wider group that would not go for harsh sanctions against Israel. But when you also when you speak about common foreign and security policy measures, there you also need a consensus. And there again, there would be those member states that would come to the assistance of Israel for different reasons and interests. So it would be much harder to do when annexation takes place, if it takes place. But there also probably Hungary to spite the EU on its different conflicts that it has with the EU would use Israel, the Israeli issue, just to get back with the EU on different other issues that it has with the European Union. So so even with common foreign and security policy decisions, declarations, those would not be as harsh as the camp that would like to see those harsh measures and declarations made. So the EU is kind of weak because of its decision-making procedures to really take harsh decisions, declarations, actions against Israel. And when you look at the bilateral possibilities of member states, then on top of the EU's mechanisms, for example, the research and innovation program that the EU has, which is the biggest one in the world. So Horizon 2020, which is just about to end this year, is almost 80 billion euros worth. And the next one is going to be over than 100 billion euros worth. So obviously, there are bilateral research agreements between Germany and Israel and between France and Israel, and there are cultural agreements, but these are really, I mean, to some extent, they're kind of negligible. They're not as big. They would harm Israel, obviously. No country would like such measures to be taken against it. But I don't see any country in the EU, and again, reminding us that Germany would not go into any measures such as those, really harming the economic relations or the economic situation here in Israel.
Thank you so much to both of you for that. So cognizant as I am that time is flying by and you two are wonderful and we have great questions, what I'd like to do is maybe do a couple of rounds in which I ask you a few questions and just, we'll go to both of you and respond to whatever you'd really like to pick out. Don't feel like you need to respond to everything. So I'm going to ask you a few questions here. We have one question that comes from Bill Berger, and it is the question of what the EU's position is on the legality of annexation. And I might just ask you to talk a little bit about how important is international law in Europe's position. Bettina Marks asks a somewhat related question. She asks, how is Europe's response to Israeli annexation of the West Bank different to Russia's annexation of Crimea? And what justification could there be for that? And a third question I'd like to throw into the mix is from Charles Kramer, who asks, will there be a difference in the European reaction to annexation depending on how much is annexed, whether it's a couple of settlement blocks or 30% of the West Bank as envisioned by the Trump plan. So Maya, why don't we go to you first this time?
Sure. First, the EU was founded already in the 1950s as sort of an answer to World War II, to the Shoah also, but mainly to conflict as a sort of a conflict resolution or peace building mechanism. So this is part, the European Union is part of the liberal world order after World War II. And I think this is why, this is part of the reason why it is so important for the EU to maintain international law and all those agreements and covenants that were agreed after World War II that try to establish this liberal world order. So the Geneva Convention, for example, from 1949, where a state cannot annex a territory unilaterally by force. We see the world order changing, in front of our eyes very rapidly in the last few years, and I think the EU would like to maintain in its neighborhood sort of the rules of would like to maintain those rules of the game. And they are being breached over and over again, right in our neighborhood. Just if you look from Israel to the east and to the west, then obviously this is not what the EU would have liked to see here in the neighborhood. And this is really bad for the stability of the neighborhood and to the stability of Europe. And we've seen the immigration crisis coming from this region to Europe. So this is just one, just a few brief elements, and they're not a full answer. So Martin, probably you can comment on that further and more deeply. With regards to Bettina Mark's questions, what is the difference between Israel's annexation of some of the territories and Russia annexation of Crimea? So to begin with, to depict the picture in Crimea, this was an independent sovereign country, member of the United Nations, where all of a sudden a neighboring country invades and conquers and annexes in 2014. Right? This is something that has to be dealt with very harshly, especially when it borders member states of the European Union. So Poland is a member, is a neighbor of Ukraine. This is really at the back. At the sort of backyard of Europe. So the response obviously had to be very harsh, especially when Russia is so big and threatening. Now, when we look at the territories, the Judea and Samaria, at 1947, the UN resolution is to have two states, right? The Israeli state for the Jewish people and the Palestinian state for the Palestinian people. And this was not the case at the end of the independence war, the way Israel defines it, at 48. Jordan actually conquers those territories and annexes those territories at 48. So until between 48 and 67, the territories are part of Jordan. Now, other than the UK and another country, nobody recognized this annexation. And at 67, when this territory sort of swaps hands into the occupation of Israel, then it's not an occupation of an independent country, member of the UN. So you could dispute, it's a bit of a different situation. This is not my own, it's not my personal opinion. This is how some Israelis to the right, very right-wing political spectrum in Israel would present it, and there is some legal scholars would actually support this opinion. Most of the legal scholars in the world do not support this opinion, and therefore even Germany at the last or the one meeting, the previous meeting of the Foreign Affairs Council, even Germany was saying, Israel annexation would not be equal to Russia's annexation, because if they would be equal, then obviously the EU would be required to impose sanctions, and big sanctions on Israel. So they're trying to differentiate, even Germany is trying to differentiate between those two kinds of annexations. The last questions, would there be a difference between a big annexation, small annexation response by the EU? I think so. I think so, definitely, because the context and the response, I mean, the way the situation would evolve here at our neighborhood. So I'm not talking about the Israeli political scenes, I'm talking about the Palestinian Authority, Jordan, Arab countries, the security situation here at the region. The harsher the response by all those players that I've mentioned, the harsher their response, the harsher would be also the EU response because of that destabilization of the region. If Israel, if the prime minister or the government chooses to only annex Ma'ale Adumim, annex Gush Etzion, which in any case the Israeli law already sort of, is there. Then obviously there would be a response, but it wouldn't be as harsh.
So Martin, before you jump in, given the time, what I'd like to do is actually throw out a few more questions. And then Martin, if there's anything you want to add to what Maya just said, and then anything you want to add to these last few questions I'm going to throw out. And then I think we'll have to wrap it up there. I apologize, but our time is short. So we have a question from Charles Kennard, who is obviously frustrated with Hungary's role in this. And he asks, can Hungary be kicked out of the EU? And if so, how? We have Rabbi Mark Dworkin, who asked if you could just comment on the UK's role on this. I don't think we've mentioned the UK. And then finally, if you'd like to say anything about the Trump administration's role in trying to influence and maybe pressure Europe not to respond to annexation. So Martin, I'm going to throw it open to you. Lots of material for last thoughts.
Right, great. So maybe let me go in the reverse order through those questions. So the Trump administration's role, in my perception, there isn't as much overt pressure and lobbying, there hasn't been from the Trump administration, but certainly, especially the Central and Eastern European states, view this whole topic very much through the prism of the transatlantic relationship, through the relationship with the US. So for many of them, the US is a more important factor in their positioning than Israel on its own. So it's absolutely central, the Trump administration, to the European positioning and the current feeble response. More broadly, I would say since Trump came into office, it has had a sort of a chilling effect on the EU's activity on this topic since 2017, as compared to the Obama years, where, when Obama came to the office, we saw the EU emboldened a little bit, to take certain measures and somewhat more outspoken positions. And now we saw a reverse effect under Trump. So I think the outcome of the US elections, whether it's Biden or Trump, will also have quite significant effect on the EU's own confidence in of voicing its positions on this issue. When it comes to Britain, they are still retaining, they are still very much aligned with the EU on the general positioning. They have joined statements with other European states 2 weeks ago at the Security Council, where they strongly refused annexation, said that it violates international law, goes against the UN Charter, which is, by the way, a response to one of the previous questions. Yeah? So that's how the Europeans see the illegality of annexation. It's about the inadmissibility of the use of force to conquer territory. At the same time, the Brits have been trying to curry favor with the Trump administration. So when it comes to the Trump plan, they have had one of the least critical and relatively most welcoming position in Europe. And I think it has been really the most like schizophrenic or contradictory position among the Europeans, because on one hand, they have been very clear they oppose the annexation. On the other hand, they have been saying, you know, we welcome Trump's initiative and maybe there should be negotiations on this basis. But of course, it's the Trump initiative which provided the groundwork for the annexation. So that is a contradiction which continues to be played out. And it's not only limited to the Brits. I think it goes more broadly for the whole EU, but it's particularly pronounced with the British position. And when it comes to kicking out Hungary, that is theoretically possible. There is an article in the EU treaty and that could suspend their voting rights in the council. And there has been a discussion about this, not because of Hungary's blocking of EU foreign policy, which has strangely enough received very little public attention, but it has been much more about Hungary's domestic record, its authoritarianism, and its trampling on democratic norms and rule of law in a number of different ways. But it is also clear that there is, you would need unanimity of all the other member states to be able to suspend Hungary's voting rights. So it is also not something that is likely in the short or medium term.
Thank you so much for that. And I really want to thank our two panelists who have been fantastic in sharing their expertise with us today. I want to apologize we got so many great questions in the audience Q&A that we just haven't gotten a chance to get to today because of our short time. Obviously, there's much more conversation to be had about this. But I think we really did tackle some very interesting issues today with regard to the European response to annexation. So thank you to everyone for tuning in today. Thank you to our panelists, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.